Power doesn't always announce itself with fanfare and flashing lights. Sometimes it walks quietly through side doors, wearing a $12 dress from the clearance rack and orthopedic shoes that click softly against marble floors. Sometimes it carries a cloth purse with fraying handles and moves with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints ache on cold mornings. And sometimes, just sometimes, the people who mistake that quietness for weakness learn the most expensive lessons of their lives. On a Tuesday morning in November, Officer Marcus Hendricks pulled his patrol cruiser into the employee parking lot behind First National Bank in Riverside, a mid-sized town where everyone knew everyone's business, or thought they did. The dispatch call had come in 20 minutes earlier. Silent alarm, triggered at the bank, immediately canceled. Probably another false trip from the new security system. Most officers would have cleared it with a radio call. But Hendricks wasn't most officers. He saw every call as an opportunity to remind people who held the power in this town. And after 15 years wearing the badge, he'd gotten very comfortable with that power. He stepped out of his cruiser, adjusting his mirrored sunglasses, even though the sun barely broke through the November clouds. At 38 years old, Marcus Hendricks had the build of a man who spent his off hours in the gym. 6'1" and 220 pounds of muscle that he used like a weapon even when his hands stayed at his sides. His uniform was always perfectly pressed. His boots mirror shined. His belt heavy with the tools of his trade. Radio flashlight, pepper spray taser, and the Glock that rested against his right hip. His hand found that hip now. Fingers drumming against the leather, a habit that made people nervous. That was the point. Unit 47 checking the premises. His voice carried the bored authority of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Behind him, Officer Maria Rodriguez climbed out of the passenger seat. Younger, quieter still, carrying the idealism of someone only 2 years on the force. She'd requested a different training officer 3 times. All 3 requests had been denied. The department had a way of protecting its own, and Hendricks had roots that ran deep. What Hendricks didn't know, what he couldn't see from the back parking lot, was the name carved into the limestone facade above the front entrance he hadn't bothered to use. Elegant letters, each one 2 feet tall. Dorothy Mae Williams, Community Financial Center. Dedicated in 2004, funded by the woman whose vision had transformed a struggling local bank into a cornerstone of community investment. 22 years of her fingerprints on every decision, every loan, every second chance given to families who needed it. But Marcus Hendricks had parked in the back, and even if he'd seen the name, he wouldn't have connected it with the woman he was about to encounter. Inside the bank, Dorothy Mae Williams moved through the employee corridor with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd walked this path every Monday morning for 2 decades. 72 years old, 5'2" even in her sensible shoes, she carried herself with a dignity that came from surviving things that would have broken lesser people. Her hair was silver pulled back in a modest bun at the base of her neck, and her face held the kind of weathered beauty that spoke of hard-earned wisdom. The lines around her eyes came from both laughter and tears, though she'd learned long ago which one served her better in public. Her floral dress had cost $11.97 at the outlet mall. She knew because she kept the receipt. Not out of poverty, but out of principle. She'd grown up in a time and place where every penny mattered, and wealth hadn't changed her habit of knowing exactly where her money went. The dress was comfortable, modest, perfect for a Monday morning reviewing quarterly reports and meeting with loan applicants. In her cloth purse, the one with the fraying handles she kept meaning to repair, she carried butterscotch candies for the teller's children, reading glasses on a beaded chain, and a cell phone that had the personal numbers of the mayor, 3 city council members, and the state attorney general. But you wouldn't know any of that by looking at her. That was exactly how Dorothy Williams preferred it. She'd learned over 7 decades that being underestimated was sometimes the greatest gift a black woman could receive. Let them see the cheap dress and the slow shuffle. Let them see an elderly woman who looked like she needed help finding the bathroom, Let them make their assumptions. And then, when the moment came, let them discover exactly how wrong they'd been. Dorothy hummed an old gospel hymn as she approached the elevator, something her mother used to sing while ironing white people's clothes for $2 an hour. His eye is on the sparrow. She'd hummed it when she'd started her cleaning business in 1976 with a borrowed mop and a prayer. She'd hummed it when she'd signed the papers to buy her first rental property. She'd hummed it at the dedication ceremony when they'd put her name on this building. It was her armor, that hymn. It reminded her that she'd survived worse than whatever today might bring. The bank wouldn't officially open for another 15 minutes, but Dorothy had her own key to the side entrance. She always arrived early on Mondays. It was her time to walk through her bank, and it was hers in every way that mattered and feel the weight of what she'd built. Not just the financial institution, though, that mattered, but the jobs created the families, housed the small businesses, launched the college educations funded. This building was more than marble and glass. It was possibility made manifest. It was proof that a girl who'd grown up in a segregated town where she couldn't even walk through the front door of the diner that used to occupy this very spot could change the world if she refused to accept other people's limitations. She checked her phone as she walked. A text from her attorney, David Morton, about a foundation board meeting later that week. Another from her granddaughter asking if she was still coming to dinner on Sunday. She smiled, typing back a quick confirmation, not noticing the police officer who'd just entered through the front entrance. But Marcus Hendricks noticed her. He stood in the lobby, hands on his belt, surveying the space with the proprietary air of someone who believed every building in town existed under his jurisdiction. The trainee teller, a nervous 19-year-old named Ashley, looked up from the counter where she was counting her starting cash drawer. The security guard, Jerome Williams, Dorothy's nephew, though Hendricks had no way of knowing that, straightened in his chair by the door. Both of them felt the shift in atmosphere that came when Hendricks entered a room. It was like the air got heavier. And then Hendricks saw Dorothy heading toward the corridor marked "Employees Only," and his entire body language changed. His jaw tightened, his shoulders squared. His hand moved to rest on his service weapon fingers, curling around the grip in a gesture that was meant to intimidate even before words were spoken. He'd seen this before, or thought he had. Elderly person confused wandering into areas they didn't belong. Usually it was harmless. But this woman was black, and she was heading toward the executive offices. And something in Hendricks' mind, something twisted by years of unchecked prejudice and a career spent getting away with it, saw a threat instead of a harmless mistake. Rodriguez, standing beside him, felt her stomach turn. She'd seen this before, too. She'd seen it in traffic stops that escalated for no reason. She'd seen it in the way Hendricks' entire demeanor changed depending on the skin color of the person he was addressing. She'd filed 2 confidential complaints with Internal Affairs. Both had disappeared into a filing cabinet somewhere. Her sergeant had suggested she might be happier at a different department. She was 26 years old and already learning that justice and law enforcement didn't always overlap. Ma'am Hendricks' voice cut across the lobby, sharp and loud. "That area's restricted." "You lost?" Dorothy turned slowly. Arthritis made quick movements impossible, but even without that physical limitation, she'd learned long ago that sudden movements around police officers who looked like Hendricks could be dangerous. She turned at a measured pace, a slight smile on her face. The kind of expression that had diffused 1,000 potential conflicts over the years. "Good morning, officer." Her voice carrying the warm courtesy of someone raised in the South, where manners were armor. "I'm heading to my office." The words hung in the air between them. To Dorothy, they were simple truth. To Hendricks, they were a challenge. His face hardened into something ugly, something that had been lurking beneath the surface of professional courtesy. His eyes traveled from her face down to her dress, that $11.97 dress, and back up again. And Dorothy saw the calculation happening behind his mirrored sunglasses. She saw him deciding who she was based on how she looked. She'd seen that look before, hundreds of times, thousands maybe. But it never stopped cutting that moment of being assessed and found wanting by someone who didn't have the first clue about her life, her accomplishments, her worth. Your office. Hendricks repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Right. He took a step toward her, and Rodriguez saw the muscles in her training officer's back tense the way they always did before things went wrong. She opened her mouth to interject. Sir, maybe we should verify. I got this, Rodriguez. The dismissal was absolute. Rodriguez closed her mouth and felt something inside her shift. Later, she would point to this moment as the one where she decided she couldn't keep silent anymore. But in the moment, she stood there and watched it unfold and hated herself a little bit for it. Hendricks closed the distance between himself and Dorothy, deliberately entering her personal space, using his height and bulk to intimidate. It was second nature to him, this physical dominance. He'd been doing it for 15 years, and it usually worked. People backed down. People apologized. People remembered their place. Dorothy Williams didn't back down. She stood her ground, which required her to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact, and she kept that same pleasant expression on her face. But inside, something was calculating. She was 72 years old. She'd built a business empire from nothing. She'd negotiated million-dollar contracts with men who'd initially refused to shake her hand. She'd stared down city councils and state regulators and banks that didn't want to lend to a black woman who'd started life cleaning office buildings at night. Marcus Hendricks wasn't the first man to try to intimidate her, and he wouldn't be the last. But he might be the one who regretted it most. Let me see some ID, Hendricks said, not asked. Now! Dorothy reached for her purse, moving slowly and deliberately. Hendricks's hand tightened on his weapon, and Dorothy felt a chill run down her spine. She was suddenly intensely aware of every news story she'd ever read about traffic stops that ended in funerals. Her hands were visible, moving in slow motion, opening the clasp of her cloth purse. Behind Hendricks, she could see the trainee teller with her phone out recording. Good girl, Dorothy thought. Evidence matters. She pulled out her wallet, extracted her driver's license, and handed it over. Hendricks snatched it from her hand and studied it with exaggerated care. Dorothy Mae Williams, he read aloud. Riverbend Gardens, Section 8 housing, low-income apartments on the east side of town. Hendricks' suspicions crystallized into certainty in his mind. This woman lived in the projects and was wandering around a bank before opening hours, claiming to work here, heading toward executive offices. In his twisted worldview, this all made perfect sense. She was either confused on drugs or casing the place for a robbery. Never mind that she was 72 and walked with visible difficulty. Never mind that she'd shown no aggression, made no suspicious movements, done nothing except try to get to her office. Marcus Hendricks saw what he'd been trained consciously or unconsciously to see. A black woman from the poor side of town who didn't belong. What are you really doing here, Ms. Williams? His tone made it clear that he didn't believe her earlier statement. Bank doesn't open for 10 minutes. How'd you get in? I work here. Dorothy repeated, her patience beginning to thin, despite her best efforts. I have a key to the side entrance. I arrive early every Monday morning to... You have a key. Hendricks interrupted, his voice rising loud enough that everyone in the lobby could hear. Sure you do. How'd you get it? Find it somewhere. Steal it off an employee. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Ashley, the trainee teller, gasped audibly. Jerome, the security guard, stood up from his desk. His young face twisted with anger and fear. He wanted to defend his aunt, but he was 19 years old, working his first real job, and Hendricks was a cop with a gun, and the calculation of risk versus reward was happening at lightning speed in his teenage brain. Dorothy felt something crack in her chest. Not break. She'd been broken before, real broken, and this wasn't that. but something cracked some reservoir of patience that she'd been carefully maintaining. "Officer," she said, her voice dropping to something colder, more controlled, "I'm asking you respectfully. Call the bank manager. He can confirm my employment, or check with the security guard, or simply allow me to show you my identification badge. But I am not going to stand here and be accused of theft." Hendrick's face flushed. He heard defiance, not reason. He heard a challenge to his authority. 15 years of getting away with this behavior had taught him that people didn't talk back to him unless they had something to hide. "I'm not calling anybody," he snapped. "You are going to explain to me why you're trespassing in a closed bank. And then you're going to let me search that purse because I'm betting there's something in there you don't want me to find." Rodriguez stepped forward, her voice urgent now. "Sir, her ID matches the name on the—" "Rodriguez," Hendricks said, not even looking at her. "If you can't handle this, wait outside." It was a direct order. Rodriguez felt the weight of it, the implication that her career would suffer if she didn't comply. She stood there frozen between duty and conscience and felt the moment slip away. Dorothy was watching this exchange with the careful attention of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading people. She saw the young female officer's discomfort. She saw the trainee teller still recording. She saw her nephew Jerome with his fists clenched at his sides. And she saw Marcus Hendricks so certain of his power, so comfortable in his prejudice, that he couldn't see the cliff he was about to walk off. "Turn around," Hendricks said, his voice carrying a finality that chilled the room. "Place your hands on that counter. I'm going to search you for weapons and contraband." "I will not," Dorothy said, each word clear and firm. "I have done nothing wrong. I have broken no laws. I am not submitting to a search." For just a moment, 2 seconds, maybe 3, Marcus Hendricks hesitated. Something in Dorothy's absolute certainty, or maybe the way Rodriguez was staring at him, or maybe some deeply buried instinct for self-preservation made him pause. His radio crackled. "Unit 47, what's your status?" The question cut through his doubt. He was a police officer, damn it. He didn't back down from old women in cheap dresses. He didn't let people talk back to him. He keyed his radio. Unit 47 handling a trespassing situation at First National Bank. Under control. Under control. The lie would later be played in court as evidence of his state of mind. But in the moment it felt true to him. He was in control. He was the law here. He reached for Dorothy's arm. The moment his hand closed around her thin wrist, everything changed. Not because Dorothy resisted. She didn't. Not because Rodriguez intervened. She couldn't. Not because anyone in the lobby moved or spoke. Everything changed because Ashley's phone was recording every second, and because the security cameras that Dorothy had personally funded were capturing every angle in high definition, and because the elevator behind them dinged at precisely that moment, and Richard Stevens stepped out carrying his morning coffee and the quarterly reports Dorothy had asked him to prepare. Richard Stevens was 49 years old, had been the bank manager for exactly 6 months, and had met Dorothy Mae Williams exactly 4 times. Always in the upstairs boardroom, always in circumstances where she wore business attire and commanded the room with the authority of someone who'd built an empire. He'd never seen her in casual clothes. He'd never seen her on a Monday morning before official opening hours, but he saw her now. And more specifically, he saw a police officer gripping her arm while she stood perfectly still with an expression of controlled fury on her face. The coffee cup fell from Stevens's hand. It shattered on the marble floor, sending liquid and ceramic shards in every direction, and the sound echoed through the lobby like a gunshot. "Oh my God," Stevens said, his voice raw with horror. Officer let go of her. "Right now." Marcus Hendricks didn't immediately comply. His brain was processing the interruption, categorizing the man in the 3-piece suit as bank employee, probably manager, someone who needed to understand that law enforcement took precedence. He kept his grip on Dorothy's arm not painfully tight. he would later claim just firm enough to maintain control of the situation, and turned his head to address Stevens. "Sir, this is police business," Hendricks said, his voice carrying the artificial patience of someone used to explaining things to civilians. "This woman was attempting to access restricted areas of your bank before opening hours. I'm conducting an investigation." Richard Stevens had gone pale. Actually pale, the color draining from his face like someone had pulled a plug. He took 3 quick steps forward, his expensive shoes crunching on broken ceramic. His hands raised in a placating gesture that was directed at Dorothy, not at the officer. "Mrs. Williams," Stevens said, and his voice was shaking. "I'm so profoundly sorry. There's been a terrible mistake." Hendricks' grip loosened fractionally. Something in Stevens' tone, in the way he'd said Mrs. Williams with that particular emphasis, penetrated the fog of Hendricks' certainty. His training officer instinct, buried under years of bad habits, recognized the sound of someone trying to prevent a disaster. "I know her name," Hendricks said, irritation creeping into his voice. "That's why I asked for ID. She claims she works here, but she doesn't work here." Stevens interrupted, and for a split second Hendricks felt vindicated. See, he'd been right. This woman didn't. She's not an employee. Stevens continued his words, tumbling out fast, now urgent, desperate to stop what was happening before it went any further. "She's the chairman of the board of directors." The words didn't immediately compute. Hendricks stared at Stevens, his hand still on Dorothy's arm. His brain trying to reconcile the elderly black woman in the discount dress with the title chairman of the board. It didn't fit. It couldn't fit. There had to be some mistake, some confusion, because people who ran banks didn't dress like this, didn't live in Riverbend Gardens, didn't look like. "She owns this bank," Stevens said, and his voice cracked on the last word. The lobby went silent. Not the comfortable silence of a space waiting to be filled, but the terrible silence of a moment where everyone present understands that something irreversible has just happened. Even the ambient noise seemed to fade. The hum of the HVAC system. The distant sound of traffic outside the tick of the antique clock on the wall. Everything stopped. Marcus Hendricks's hand fell away from Dorothy's arm like she'd suddenly become radioactive. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. His mind was racing, stumbling, tripping over itself, trying to find some explanation, some way that this information could be wrong. He looked at Dorothy, really looked at her for the first time, and saw something in her eyes that made his blood run cold. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't relieved. She wasn't even particularly pleased. She was furious, and she'd been waiting for this moment with the patient calculation of someone who knew exactly what was coming. "Officer Hendricks," Dorothy said, and her voice was ice absolute zero, cold enough to burn. "You did not ask me who I was. You decided what I was, and now we're all going to live with the consequences of that decision." The shift in her demeanor was subtle, but complete. Seconds ago, she'd been on the defensive, explaining herself, trying to de-escalate. Now she stood differently, spoke differently. This was Dorothy Mae Williams in her element, the woman who'd built businesses and crushed competitors and negotiated with people who'd tried to cheat her. The cheap dress hadn't changed, but everything else had. Hendricks tried to recover. His training kicked in. Apologize, de-escalate, get control of the situation before it gets worse. But his pride got in the way, the same pride that had insulated him from consequences for 15 years. Ma'am, there was no way to know. You didn't identify yourself as... I told you I worked here." Dorothy cut him off, and there was steel in her voice now. "I offered to show you identification. I suggested you call the manager. You did none of those things. You saw an elderly black woman in inexpensive clothes, and you decided I was a criminal. Do you understand what you've done?" Hendricks understood. It was starting to sink in the magnitude of his mistake, but his brain was still trying to find escape routes. The union. His record. Surely this was just a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over. People made mistakes. He'd apologize, she'd accept it, and they'd all move on. He had no idea who Dorothy Williams was, what she was capable of, what she'd survived to get here. Dorothy reached into her purse, moving slowly enough that no one could claim she'd made a threatening gesture, and pulled out her cell phone. She scrolled through her contacts with arthritic fingers, found the name she wanted, and pressed call. The phone rang twice before someone answered. "David," Dorothy said, her voice perfectly controlled. "It's Dorothy. I need you at First National Bank. Immediately." There was a pause while the person on the other end, David, whoever that was, responded. Hendricks felt his stomach tighten. That was the kind of call people made to their attorneys. "Yes," Dorothy continued. "It happened again. But no, this time, I'm the victim. And David. This time we have everything on video." She hung up without saying goodbye and looked at Hendricks with an expression that made him want to run. "You have 8 minutes before my attorney arrives," she said. "I suggest you use them to pray that your union can afford better lawyers than mine." Rodriguez, who'd been standing frozen in horror for the last 2 minutes, finally found her voice. "Mrs. Williams, I tried to tell him." Dorothy held up one hand, silencing her, but when she spoke to Rodriguez, her voice was gentler. "I know you did, sweetheart. I heard you. And I'm going to need a statement from you about everything you witnessed here. Will you be willing to provide that?" "Yes, ma'am," Rodriguez said immediately. "Everything. Every word." Hendricks shot Rodriguez a look of pure venom. That look, captured on Ashley's phone and 3 different security cameras, would later be used in court to demonstrate retaliation against a fellow officer. But in the moment, Hendricks was too busy trying to figure out how to salvage his career to think about the optics. "Mrs. Williams," Stevens interjected, his voice still shaking, "I cannot apologize enough for what's happened here. This is absolutely unacceptable, and I assure you that we'll take every measure to—" Dorothy turned that same hand toward Stevens, cutting him off mid-sentence. "Richard," she said, and there was something almost pitying in her tone. "Call Chief Reeves. Tell her I need her here immediately, and pull all security footage from the last 30 minutes. Every camera angle. I want copies ready for my attorney when he arrives." Stevens nodded rapidly and practically ran toward his office, pulling out his cell phone as he went. Dorothy turned to Ashley, the trainee teller, who was still holding her phone up, still recording. "Young lady," Dorothy said. "What's your name, A?" "Ashley, ma'am." The girl stammered. "Ashley. I need you to send me that video. Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am. Right now? Right now. My attorney will need it." Ashley's fingers flew across her phone screen. 30 seconds later, Dorothy's phone chimed with an incoming message. She checked it, nodded, and looked at Jerome, her nephew, who was still standing by the security desk with his fists clenched. "Jerome," she said quietly, and the young man's face crumpled with relief at being addressed. "Are you all right?" "Yes, Aunt Dorothy," he managed. "I'm sorry I didn't know what to do. I wanted to help, but you did exactly right by staying calm," Dorothy told him firmly. "And now I need you to do something for me. Go upstairs to the security office. Make sure every second of the last half hour is backed up to 3 separate drives. Can you do that?" Jerome nodded and practically sprinted toward the stairs. Dorothy finally turned back to Hendricks, who'd been standing there watching this display of command with growing dread. He was starting to understand that he hadn't just made a mistake. He'd walked into a trap, one that had been baited by his own prejudice and sprung by his own actions. "Officer Hendricks," Dorothy said, and her voice was conversational now, almost friendly, which somehow made it worse. "I want you to sit down over there." She pointed to a chair in the lobby waiting area. "Don't move. Don't speak. Don't touch your radio. If you try to leave, it will make everything worse for you." "Do you understand?" Hendricks wanted to argue. wanted to assert his authority, remind everyone that he was a police officer and she couldn't order him around. But something in Dorothy's eyes stopped him. Some recognition that he'd lost whatever power dynamic he'd thought existed here. He sat. Rodriguez remained standing, her body language carefully separate from her training officers, making it clear to everyone watching that she was not part of whatever had just happened. She caught Dorothy's eye and saw a flicker of approval there. The lobby settled into an uncomfortable silence. Outside, morning traffic was picking up. Inside, Marcus Hendricks sat in a chair meant for bank customers and felt his career slipping away like water through his fingers. He tried to think through his options. He could call the union rep, now get ahead of this. He could explain to his supervisor that there'd been a misunderstanding. He could, but every option he considered ran into the same wall. The video. The video of him grabbing an elderly black woman who owned the bank he was supposed to be protecting. The video of him refusing to verify her identity. The video of his hand on her arm, her face calm and controlled, his face twisted with an authority he'd never actually possessed. 8 minutes felt like 8 hours. Dorothy stood in the center of the lobby, checking her phone, responding to emails, looking for all the world like someone waiting for a routine appointment. But inside her mind was racing through scenarios, strategies, outcomes. She'd been building toward this moment for years without knowing it. Every time she'd heard about another black person harassed by police, every time she'd written a check to the ACLU or the Urban League, every time she'd sat in meetings with the previous police chief Hendricks's cousin, she'd later learn and tried to discuss accountability measures that somehow never got implemented. She'd been patient, she'd been professional, she'd worked within the system, and the system had failed her anyway. But this time she had something she hadn't had in those other cases. Power. Real power. The kind that came from wealth and position and connections, and the ability to hire the best attorney in the state. And she was going to use every ounce of it not for revenge. Revenge was petty and beneath her, but for justice. For herself, yes. But more importantly, for every person who looked like her who'd been in this situation without the resources to fight back. The front door opened. David Morton walked in. David Morton was 67 years old and looked like someone's kindly grandfather, which was exactly what he wanted people to think right up until he destroyed them in court. He was 5'8", gray-haired, wore wire-rimmed glasses and cardigans, and carried a battered leather briefcase that was older than some of his law clerks. He'd been practicing civil rights law for 43 years, had argued 2 cases before the Supreme Court, and had never not once lost a case involving police misconduct. He took one look at the scene in the bank lobby and understood everything. Dorothy. He said, his voice gentle, concerned, the voice of an old friend. "Are you hurt?" "My wrist is bruised," Dorothy replied calmly. "My dignity is intact." Morton's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes that made Hendricks's stomach turn. It was the look of a predator that had just spotted wounded prey. Which officer, Morton asked, though he was already looking at Hendricks. "Officer Marcus Hendricks," Dorothy said. "Badge number 4127. Morton pulled a legal pad from his briefcase and began writing. "And the incident occurred approximately 15 minutes ago. We have multiple camera angles plus video from one of the teller's cell phones. Officer Rodriguez witnessed the entire interaction and has agreed to provide a statement." Morton glanced at Rodriguez, who nodded confirmation. He made another note. "Officer Hendricks." Morton said, his voice remaining pleasant, conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. "Did you identify yourself and provide your badge number before making physical contact with Mrs. Williams?" Hendricks opened his mouth, closed it. His training, buried under 15 years of bad habits, was screaming at him not to say anything without a union rep present. But Morton's grandfatherly demeanor was disarming, and Hendricks made his second mistake of the morning. "I identified myself when I entered the premises," he said. "And she, Mrs. Williams, was attempting to access a restricted area before banking hours. I had reason to believe—" "That's on video," Morton interrupted gently. "We'll verify. Did you have probable cause for detention?" "She was trespassing in her own building," Morton said, still pleasant, still smiling slightly. "With her own key. After you refused multiple opportunities to verify her identity through the bank manager, the security guard, or her employee credentials. That's also on video." Each sentence was a nail being hammered into a coffin. Hendricks could hear, it could feel his options narrowing with every word. He looked to Rodriguez for support, but she was carefully studying the floor. The front door opened again. This time, Police Chief Patricia Reeves entered, and the atmosphere in the room shifted again. Patricia Reeves was 51 years old, had been on the force for 29 years, and had been chief for exactly 11 months. She was the first black woman to hold the position in Riverside's history, a fact that had been celebrated in some quarters and resented in others. She wore her uniform like armor, every crease perfect, every button polished. Her face was unreadable as she took in the scene. Dorothy Williams standing calm and controlled in the center of the lobby. David Morton with his legal pad. Officer Rodriguez standing apart from her training officer, and Marcus Hendricks sitting in a customer chair looking like a man watching his life end. "Miss Dorothy," Reeves said, and there was something in the way she said it. Not Mrs. Williams, but Miss Dorothy, a term of respect that carried the weight of history and relationship. "Patricia." Dorothy replied, and 30 years of shared history passed between them in that single word. They'd met in 1994. Patricia Reeves had been a young patrol officer, one of only 3 black women in the department, dealing with harassment from her fellow officers and resistance from the community. Dorothy had been on the board of the Urban League, then running programs for at-risk youth. Patricia had volunteered to speak at one of the programs. Dorothy had seen something in her, intelligence, integrity, determination, and had taken her under her wing. Mentorship, networking, advocacy. When Patricia had tested for Sergeant, Dorothy had made some phone calls. When she'd applied for Lieutenant, Dorothy had written a recommendation. When the chief position opened up last year, Dorothy had personally lobbied 3 city council members. Patricia Reeves owed her career, at least in part, to Dorothy Williams. And more than that, she genuinely respected her. Loved her even in the way you love someone who believed in you when no one else did. Looking at Dorothy, now standing in the bank lobby with a bruised wrist and controlled fury in her eyes, Patricia Reeves felt something cold and terrible settle in her chest. "Officer Hendricks," Reeves said, her voice carrying the flat authority of someone who'd made a decision and wasn't interested in debate. "Badge and weapon. Now." Hendricks lurched to his feet. "Chief, please let me explain." "I didn't ask for an explanation," Reeves said. "I gave you an order. Badge. Weapon. Now." The now cracked like a whip. Hendricks fumbled at his belt, his hands shaking, and unholstered his Glock. He handed it over, gripped first the proper protocol, and then unpinned his badge from his uniform shirt. Both items felt impossibly heavy in his hands and impossibly light when Reeves took them. "You're suspended pending internal affairs investigation," Reeves said. "Go home. Don't talk to anyone. Don't post on social media. Don't leave town. You'll be contacted within 24 hours to schedule a formal interview. If you're smart, which I'm starting to doubt, you'll call your union rep immediately. Chief, go home." Hendricks went. He walked toward the door with his shoulders hunched, trying to make himself smaller, and Rodriguez didn't look at him as he passed. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like a cell door locking. Reeves turned to Rodriguez. "You witnessed this?" "Every second, ma'am. Full written statement. My office. 2 hours? And Rodriguez." "Yes, ma'am." You did the right thing trying to stop him. That's going in your file, the good part of your file." Rodriguez's face flooded with relief. "Thank you, ma'am." Reeves nodded dismissal, and Rodriguez left, leaving just the three of them in the lobby. Reeves, Dorothy, and Morton. "Patricia," Dorothy said quietly, "I need his complete file. Every complaint, every incident report, every performance review, every settlement, everything." Reeves didn't hesitate. "You'll have it by end of day. And I want to know how many other people he did this to. How many complaints were filed and dismissed. How many victims were paid off and silenced. I've been trying to build that case for 11 months, Reeves said, and there was frustration and anger in her voice. But every witness signed NDAs. Every complaint from before my time was marked resolved with no details. Every video was mysteriously corrupted or deleted. You're the first victim who can't be silenced, Miss Dorothy. You're the first one with the resources to fight back." "Then we fight," Dorothy said simply. "Not just for me, for all of them." Morton was writing the entire time, his pen scratching across the legal pad. "Patricia, I'll need copies of everything you give Dorothy, and I'll be filing a federal civil rights complaint this afternoon. I need you to understand this is going to get very public very fast." "I understand," Reeves said. "And frankly, it's about damn time." Dorothy allowed herself a small, grim smile. "Patricia, tell me something honestly. How did Hendricks survive this long 23 complaints you said? How does someone rack up 23 complaints without being fired?" Reeves's jaw tightened. "You want the truth?" "His cousin was chief before me. Marcus Henderson. Everything that came across his desk about Hendricks went into a drawer and never came out. Every settlement was paid from a discretionary fund that doesn't require city council approval. Every IA investigator who pushed too hard got reassigned to night shifts in the worst neighborhoods until they quit or stopped asking questions. Corruption," Morton said, making a note. "Corruption," Reeves confirmed. "But I couldn't prove it until now. Henderson retired last year with full pension before I could build a case. But Hendricks," she looked at Dorothy, "he just handed us everything we need on a silver platter." Dorothy sat down for the first time since the incident began. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, and she suddenly felt every one of her 72 years. Her wrist throbbed where Hendricks had grabbed her. Her joints ached. She was tired, but she wasn't done. "David," she said, looking at her attorney. "What's our next move?" Morton smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. "We document everything. We file the federal complaint. We contact every victim we can find. And then we hold a press conference and we make this story so public that the police union can't make it disappear. Win 3 days. That gives me time to do preliminary interviews and compile the initial evidence." Dorothy nodded. "Patricia, I need one more thing from you. Name it. When you pull Hendricks' file, I need you to cross-reference every complaint with any video evidence that was supposedly lost or corrupted. I want to know if there's a pattern of evidence destruction." Reeves smiled grimly. "I'll have that for you, too." They talked for another 20 minutes, planning strategy, discussing timelines, coordinating their approach. Richard Stevens reappeared with copies of all the security footage on 3 separate flash drives. Ashley gave Morton her contact information and agreed to testify if needed. Jerome confirmed that every security recording was backed up and secured. And through it all, Dorothy sat in the lobby of the bank that bore her name, the bank she'd built from nothing, and felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She could walk away. She had the power to make this go away quietly, probably. A settlement. An apology. Maybe even Hendricks's termination, though the union would fight it. But she kept thinking about Maria Gonzalez, whose complaint had been dismissed. About James Porter, whose video evidence had been corrupted. About Devin Chen, who'd been detained for 90 minutes despite having done nothing wrong. About every person who'd faced Hendrix's prejudice without the resources to fight back. She thought about her granddaughter Keisha, who was 16 and starting to drive. What happened when Keisha got pulled over by someone like Hendrix? What happened when she didn't have the protection of Dorothy's name and wealth? No. This wasn't going away quietly. This was going to be loud. Later that evening, Dorothy sat in her modest living room in Riverbend Gardens. The apartment was small, 2 bedrooms, but it was home. She'd chosen to stay here after she'd made her fortune, chosen not to move to the wealthy side of town. Her neighbors were her people. Working families, elderly folks on fixed incomes, single mothers making it work on minimum wage. This was where she belonged. Keisha had arrived an hour ago, worried having seen the news reports that were already starting to circulate. Prominent banker, detained by police. Officer suspended after incident at local bank. The story was getting out even before Morton's official press conference. "Grandma," Keisha said for the 3rd time. "Are you sure you're okay?" "I'm fine, baby," Dorothy assured her. Just tired. But she wasn't fine, not really. She was angry in a way she hadn't been in years. Angry at Hendrix, yes, but more angry at the system that had protected him. Angry at the previous chief who'd buried complaints. Angry at the union that prioritized protecting bad officers over protecting the community. Angry at a culture that allowed men like Hendrix to see people like her as threats instead of human beings. She was angry, and she was going to use that anger to burn the whole rotten structure down. David Morton worked through the night. His law office, cluttered with file boxes and legal treatises, glowed with lamplight as he and 2 of his associates compiled evidence. They started with Hendrix's personnel file, which Chief Reeves had delivered as promised. 23 complaints, 19 involving minorities. The pattern was undeniable. But it was when they started cross-referencing complaints with city financial records that the real story emerged. 4 settlements in 6 years. 4 victims paid off with non-disclosure agreements attached. The amounts varied. $30,000, $45,000, $52,000, $53,000. Totaling $180,000 of taxpayer money spent to make Marcus Hendrix victims disappear. And every single settlement had been paid from something called the Police Benevolent Association Legal Defense Fund, a discretionary account managed by the police union that operated with minimal oversight. Morton pulled the NDAs. They were airtight, legally speaking. The victims had signed away their right to discuss the incidents in exchange for the settlements. Standard practice, technically legal and morally repugnant. He started making phone calls. The first was to Maria Gonzalez. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice cautious. Morton introduced himself, explained the situation, and asked if she'd be willing to discuss her experience with Officer Hendrix despite the NDA. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "He did the same thing to someone else," Maria finally said. "He did the same thing to at least 22 other people." Morton replied, "Mrs. Williams is the only one with the resources to fight back. But we want to tell your story, too. The NDA has an exception for criminal investigations and civil rights violations. We believe we can invalidate it." Another silence. "Then what do you need from me?" Morton smiled. The second call was to James Porter. "Same script, same result." Porter agreed immediately, his voice shaking with anger that he'd clearly been holding in for 5 years. The third call was to Devin Chen, who was now 24 and studying criminal justice at the State University. "I've been waiting for someone to ask," Chen said. "When do you need me?" By dawn, Morton had statements from 7 victims. 7 people who'd filed complaints that were dismissed. 7 people who'd been paid off or ignored. 7 people willing to testify. And every single one of them described the same pattern. Hendricks targeting minorities in unexpected places, assuming criminality based on appearance, refusing to de-escalate using his authority as a weapon. Morton compiled it all into a 37-page preliminary report. He sent copies to Dorothy Chief Reeves, the city attorney, the ACLU, and the FBI's Civil Rights Division. By 9 a.m., phones were ringing in offices across the state. Chief Reeves spent the morning in her office, the door closed, her phone silenced, working through her own investigation. She'd inherited a department that was deeply resistant to change. The old guard officers who'd served under the previous chief, who saw reform as betrayal, made up nearly 60% of her force. They'd been waiting for her to fail, hoping she'd prove their belief that women, especially black women, couldn't handle the job. She'd been building her case, carefully documenting everything, waiting for the moment when she'd have enough evidence to force real change. Dorothy's incident had just accelerated her timeline by about 2 years. She pulled video logs for every body camera in the department over the past 6 months, cross-referenced them with citizen complaints, found 17 incidents where body cameras had been turned off accidentally during encounters that resulted in complaints, found 12 more where footage had been corrupted before it could be reviewed. The pattern of evidence destruction was impossible to ignore. She called a mandatory meeting of all supervisors for that afternoon. Attendance was not optional. Marcus Hendricks spent the morning at home calling his union rep every 30 minutes and getting voicemail every time. His wife Sarah had taken the kids to her mother's house. She'd kissed him goodbye that morning, like always, but there was something in her eyes he'd never seen before. Doubt, maybe, or fear. The local news was running the story every hour. Officer suspended after incident at bank. They had a photo of him in uniform from 3 years ago, looking proud and strong. They had a photo of Dorothy Williams from some charity event looking dignified and composed. They had a statement from the bank expressing full confidence in Mrs. Williams and promising cooperation with all investigations. They didn't have the video yet, but Hendricks knew it was only a matter of time. He opened his laptop and started searching David Morton. What he found made his blood run cold. 43 years practicing civil rights law, never lost a police misconduct case, not once. Known for absolutely destroying officers on the stand for making juries see the victims as human beings and the officers as oppressors. Hendricks had never thought of himself as an oppressor. He was a cop. He kept the peace. He protected people. If he had to be a little rough sometimes, if he had to make some assumptions based on experience, well, that was just part of the job. Wasn't it? For the first time in 15 years, Marcus Hendricks was starting to question his own narrative. Dorothy spent the morning at the bank, conducting business as usual. She had meetings, scheduled loan applications to review a conference call with the foundation board. She did all of it with her usual efficiency, her bruised wrist hidden under long sleeves, her face composed. But in the quiet moments between obligations, she found herself thinking about her mother. Loretta Williams had died in 1976, 3 months after the bank it was called Riverside Savings, then had foreclosed on her house. Dorothy had been 19 years old, working 3 jobs, trying to keep up with the mortgage payments after her father's death. She'd been $2,400 behind. The bank had refused to work with her. Foreclosed, evicted, destroyed her mother's will to live. Dorothy remembered standing outside the courthouse after the foreclosure hearing, watching her mother cry and making a promise to herself. Never again. She would never be powerless again. She would build something that could protect people like her mother from people who saw them as numbers on a balance sheet. It had taken her 48 years to build that protection, and now a cop with a badge and a prejudice had tried to strip it away in 8 minutes. She wasn't going to let that stand. At 2 p.m., Morton held a preliminary press conference on the steps of City Hall. Dorothy stood beside him, flanked by Chief Reeves on one side and 3 of the previous victims on the other. The media presence was substantial. Local stations, regional papers, a stringer from CNN. Morton spoke first, his voice carrying clearly in the November air. 3 days ago, Mrs. Dorothy Mae Williams, a prominent businesswoman and philanthropist, was detained and physically restrained by Officer Marcus Hendricks at First National Bank. She was accused of trespassing. In her own bank, Officer Hendricks had multiple opportunities to verify her identity and chose not to. He had multiple opportunities to de-escalate and chose not to. He had multiple opportunities to recognize his mistake and chose not to. Morton paused, letting the words sink in. But this is not a story about one incident. This is a story about a pattern. Officer Hendricks has been the subject of 23 complaints in 15 years. 19 of those complaints involved minorities. 4 resulted in settlements totaling $180,000 of taxpayer money. Every single complaint was dismissed by the previous administration. He gestured to the 3 people standing beside Dorothy. Maria Gonzalez was stopped by Officer Hendricks in 2021. James Porter was stopped in 2019. Devin Chen was detained in 2022. All of them filed complaints. All of them were dismissed. All of them were told there wasn't enough evidence, or that they'd misunderstood, or that the officer's actions were justified. Maria stepped forward, her hands shaking slightly but her voice steady. Officer Hendricks looked at me in my nurse's scrubs and assumed I'd stolen them. He looked at my skin color and my last name and decided I was lying. I filed a complaint. I was told to move on. I couldn't afford a lawyer like Mr. Morton. I couldn't fight back. So I stayed silent. James Porter spoke next. I've lived in Brookfield Heights for 12 years. I teach math at the high school. I coach the debate team. Officer Hendricks pulled me over and searched my car because he said I looked suspicious driving a nice car in a nice neighborhood. The neighborhood where I live, where I pay property taxes, where I belong. Devin Chen finished. I'm studying criminal justice because of what happened to me. I want to be a better cop than Officer Hendricks. I want to prove that law enforcement can serve everyone, not just people who look a certain way. Dorothy didn't speak. She didn't need to. The 3 victims spoke for her, spoke for all of them. Morton concluded. We are filing a federal civil rights lawsuit against Officer Hendricks and the Riverside Police Department. We are calling for a full investigation into the culture of dismissing complaints against officers. We are calling for an independent civilian review board with real authority. And we are calling for justice not just for Mrs. Williams, but for every person who was victimized by this system. The questions from reporters came fast and furious. Morton fielded them expertly, giving enough information to keep the story alive, but holding back enough to maintain legal advantage. By 6 p.m., the story was everywhere. Local news led with it. Regional outlets picked it up. CNN ran a segment. Social media exploded with hashtags. The pressure was building, and it was only going to get worse. The City Council called an emergency session for 72 hours after the incident. It was scheduled for 7 p.m. on a Friday, specifically timed to minimize public attendance. People had weekend plans, were tired from work, wouldn't want to sit through a 3-hour hearing. They miscalculated. By 6:30 p.m., the council chambers were packed. Every seat filled, people standing along the walls, overflow crowds in the hallway watching on closed-circuit television. Dorothy had made phone calls. David Morton had contacted every civil rights organization in the state. Chief Reeves had quietly encouraged community attendance through her network of allies. The result was overwhelming. Council President Lisa Taylor called the session to order at exactly 7 p.m. She was 53 years old, had served on the council for 12 years, and had never seen the chambers this full. She'd also never seen her fellow council members look this nervous. They'd been getting calls, lots of calls, from constituents, from advocacy groups, from the media. The pressure was extraordinary. We convened this emergency session to address complaint number 2024447 regarding Officer Marcus Hendricks of the Riverside Police Department. Taylor said, her voice carrying through the chamber with practiced authority. We will hear presentations from Chief Reeves, from Mr. David Morton, representing Mrs. Dorothy Williams, and from the Fraternal Order of Police. We will then vote on Resolution 2024-117, which proposes termination of Officer Hendricks and implementation of comprehensive police reform measures. The FOP representative, a veteran officer named Thomas Brennan, stood first. He was 60 years old, built like a bear, and had been defending officers for 32 years. He'd never lost a termination case. He was about to lose this one. "Council members," Brennan began. "Officer Marcus Hendricks has served this community with distinction for 15 years. He has received multiple commendations. He has never been convicted of any wrongdoing. The incident at First National Bank, while unfortunate, was a misunderstanding based on reasonable assumptions given the circumstances." "Reasonable assumptions," Morton said quietly from his seat. Not loud enough to be an official interruption, but loud enough to be heard. Brennan continued, but his voice carried less certainty now. Officer Hendricks had responded to a silent alarm. He encountered an individual in an area marked for employees only before official business hours. His training dictated that he investigate. Any appearance of profiling is purely coincidental and not supported by his overall record. Taylor leaned forward. "Mr. Brennan, are you familiar with the 23 complaints filed against Officer Hendricks over his 15-year career?" Brennan's jaw tightened. "I am aware that complaints have been filed, yes. None resulted in disciplinary action, which suggests they were without merit." "Or," Taylor said, "it suggests they were repeatedly dismissed without proper investigation." Chief Reeves stood. "Council President, may I present evidence?" Taylor nodded. Reeves stepped to the podium carrying a tablet computer. She connected it to the chamber's projection system, and the large screen behind the council members lit up with the security footage from First National Bank. The room went silent. For the next 8 minutes, everyone in the chamber watched Marcus Hendricks destroy his career. They watched him approach Dorothy, heard his condescending tone, saw him refuse multiple opportunities to verify her identity, watched him grab her arm, saw the moment Richard Stevens emerged from the elevator, and the horrible realization dawned on Hendricks's face. The video ended. No one spoke. "That," Reeves said quietly, "is what Officer Hendricks's distinguished service looks like." She pulled up another screen. This one showed a spreadsheet. 23 complaints, 19 involving minorities. Here's complaint number 7. James Porter. Black male high school teacher pulled over for suspicious behavior in his own neighborhood. Complaint dismissed. Reason, insufficient evidence. Actual reason, body camera footage was corrupted. She scrolled down. Complaint 14. Maria Gonzalez, Hispanic female registered nurse, stopped in hospital parking lot and accused of stealing her work scrubs. Complaint dismissed. Reason, misunderstanding. Actual reason, officer's word given priority over video evidence from hospital security cameras. She kept scrolling, kept reading. Each complaint told the same story in different words, and with each one, the council members' faces grew more troubled. 4 of these complaints, Reeves continued, resulted in settlements. 4 victims paid off to stay quiet. Total $180,000 of taxpayer money spent covering up Officer Hendricks's pattern of misconduct. All settlements paid from a discretionary fund that operates without city council oversight. All settlements approved by my predecessor, who was Officer Hendricks's cousin. The last sentence landed like a bomb. Council members looked at each other. This wasn't just about one bad cop. This was about corruption at the highest levels of the department. Taylor called for victim testimony. Maria Gonzalez stood. She was 34 years old, had been a nurse for 9 years, and had never spoken publicly about what happened to her in 2021. Her voice shook as she approached the podium, but her words were clear. Officer Hendricks looked at my brown skin and my last name and decided I was a criminal. she said. He didn't see my nursing degree. He didn't see the 12-hour shift I'd just worked. He didn't see me as a person. He saw a stereotype, and he treated me like one. I filed a complaint. I was told there wasn't enough evidence. I was told to move on. I tried to move on, but 3 weeks later I got a call from a lawyer representing the city. They offered me $45,000 to sign a paper saying I'd never talk about what happened. I took it because I have student loans and rent, and I was scared. But I've regretted it every day since. She looked directly at the council members. When I heard about Mrs. Williams, I cried. I cried because finally, someone believed what happened. Someone cared. The only difference between me and Mrs. Williams is that she owns a bank and I work in one. Is that really how justice is supposed to work? James Porter testified next. Then, Devin Chen. Then, 4 more victims, each one describing the same pattern. Targeted, dismissed, silenced. By the time they finished, several council members were wiping their eyes. Dorothy stood last. She approached the podium, slowly leaning on her cane, wearing the same floral dress she'd worn on Monday morning. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Council members. She said, her voice carrying that quiet authority that came from surviving 7 decades of underestimation. I didn't come here for an apology. Apologies are cheap. I came here because Maria Gonzalez filed a complaint and nobody listened. Because James Porter filed a complaint and it disappeared. Because Devin Chen spent 90 minutes in detention for the crime of being Asian while shopping and the system shrugged. She paused, letting her words settle. I'm standing here because I own a bank, because I have money for lawyers, because the mayor plays golf with my late husband, because I have power. But what about the people who don't? What happens to them? For 15 years, the answer has been nothing. They suffer in silence. They take settlements and sign NDAs. They learn to avoid certain neighborhoods, certain officers, certain situations. They teach their children to be afraid. Her voice hardened. Officer Hendricks looked at me and saw a criminal because I'm black and elderly and dressed modestly. He grabbed my arm on camera in a bank that bears my name and still didn't recognize his mistake. If that can happen to me with all my privilege and power, imagine what happens to people without those protections. She looked at each council member in turn. You have an opportunity tonight to do something that matters. Not just fire one officer, though that's important, but to change a culture, to send a message that complaints will be investigated, not dismissed, that victims will be believed, not silenced, that power comes with accountability. She stepped back from the podium. The choice is yours, but make no mistake, the world is watching. Taylor called for a vote on Resolution 2024-117. The resolution was comprehensive. Terminate. Officer Hendricks suspend 3 other officers who'd witnessed his misconduct and failed to report it. Establish an independent civilian review board with subpoena, power mandate, body cameras for all officers, ban quota-based enforcement, and allocate funding for implicit bias training. This is a binding vote, Taylor announced. All in favor. 8 hands rose. Slowly at first, then with increasing confidence. Only Council Member Robert Davis kept his hand down, opposed. Davis raised his hand alone. He would lose his seat in the next election. The measure passes 8-1, Taylor said and brought the gavel down. Resolution 2024-117 is hereby adopted. Officer Marcus Hendricks's employment with the Riverside Police Department is terminated effective immediately. This hearing is adjourned. The gallery erupted in applause, not celebration. There was too much pain in that room for celebration, but acknowledgement, relief, validation. Dorothy remained seated, her hands folded in her lap. Maria Gonzalez approached and hugged her, crying. James Porter shook her hand with both of his. Devin Chen simply said thank you and Dorothy saw in his eyes the kind of hope that made everything worthwhile. Outside in the parking lot, Marcus Hendricks sat in his car. He'd watched the hearing on his phone, streaming the local news coverage. He'd heard every word of testimony, seen the video played over and over, watched the vote. For 15 years he had been protected by his cousin, by the union, by a culture that valued officer solidarity over community trust. He'd genuinely believed that he was doing his job, that his instincts were right, that people who complained were just troublemakers looking for payouts. But sitting in his car, watching his career end on a phone screen, Marcus Hendricks finally understood what he'd done. Not just to Dorothy Williams, though that was bad enough, but to Maria Gonzalez, James Porter Devon Chen, and all the others whose names he'd forgotten or never learned. He'd treated them as less than human. He'd used his badge as a weapon. He'd become exactly the kind of cop he'd once sworn he'd never be. His wife had taken the kids. His house would be foreclosed. 2 incomes had become none, and the legal fees were mounting. His pension was under review. His face was on national news not as a hero but as a cautionary tale. He'd become unemployable in law enforcement and toxic everywhere else. He'd lost everything in 8 minutes. But sitting there in the darkness of the parking lot, Marcus Hendricks finally realized something. Dorothy Williams hadn't destroyed his career. He'd destroyed it himself, one prejudiced assumption at a time over 15 years. She'd just been the one strong enough to hold up the mirror and make him look. 3 months passed. Winter gave way to early spring, and Riverside slowly adjusted to its new reality. The Civilian Review Board was operational by January, chaired by a retired federal judge and composed of community members who actually reflected the community, diverse in race, age, economic background. In its first 2 months, the board reviewed 47 complaints, including several that had been pending for years. 3 officers were disciplined. 2 resigned rather than face investigation. The message was clear. The old protections were gone. Body cameras were issued to every officer funded by a grant from Dorothy Williams's foundation. The footage was automatically uploaded to secure servers with civilian oversight. In the first month, use of force incidents dropped by 37%. Complaints dropped by 42%. Either officers were behaving better or they'd always been behaving better than the bad apples suggested. Probably both. Marcus Hendricks pled guilty to deprivation of rights under color of law, a federal charge carrying up to a year in prison and permanent loss of law enforcement credentials. His attorney negotiated a plea deal. 6 months in federal custody, 3 years supervised release, permanent prohibition from law enforcement or security work. His civil trial was pending. Dorothy and 6 other victims had filed suit seeking compensatory and punitive damages. His house was in foreclosure. His marriage was over. His children had changed schools twice to escape the publicity. He was working at his cousin's auto shop when he could find work living in a studio apartment attending court-mandated counseling sessions, where a therapist tried to help him understand how 15 years of unexamined prejudice had destroyed everything he'd built. Some days he understood. Most days he just felt angry and sorry for himself. The 3 officers who'd been suspended for failing to report Hendricks' misconduct faced their own reckoning. 2 accepted demotions and transfers. 1 resigned and moved to another state. All 3 would carry the stain of complicity for the rest of their careers. Officer Maria Rodriguez was promoted to detective in February, assigned to the Community Liaison Division. Her willingness to stand up to Hendricks to provide testimony despite the professional risks had earned her respect from Chief Reeves and the reformist faction within the department. She was 26 years old and already being groomed for leadership. The previous police chief, Marcus Henderson, was under investigation by the FBI for his role in repeatedly dismissing complaints and facilitating hush money payments. He'd retired with full pension before anyone could stop it, but his reputation was destroyed. He spent his days fishing alone, avoiding former colleagues who now viewed him as a traitor to everything law enforcement was supposed to represent. Maria Gonzalez used her portion of the civil settlement to pay off her student loans and start a nonprofit providing legal resources to victims of police misconduct. She'd found her calling in the aftermath of her worst experience. James Porter became a vocal advocate for police reform, speaking at community forums and school board meetings. His students learned about civil rights not from textbooks, but from their teachers' lived experience. Devin Chen graduated at the top of his criminal justice class and was recruited by 3 different departments. He chose to stay in Riverside, joining Chief Reeves's reformed police force. On his first day, he wore his uniform with pride and purpose, determined to be the kind of officer who proved that good policing was possible. And Dorothy went back to work. Monday morning, 3 months after the incident, she walked through the side entrance of First National Bank at 8:45 a.m., wearing a different floral dress, but the same sensible shoes. The security cameras her foundation's donation tracked her progress through the lobby. Jerome waved from his desk. Ashley, the trainee teller who'd recorded the original incident, called out a cheerful greeting. Dorothy rode the elevator to her office on the 3rd floor. The walls were lined with photographs. Her late husband, her children, her 14 grandchildren, her business licenses and board certifications. The front page of the newspaper from the day they'd renamed the bank in her honor. And in a new frame, a letter from the Department of Justice commending her courage in coming forward and facilitating their investigation into police misconduct. She sat at her desk and looked out at Main Street below. A police cruiser drove past. She could see the body camera mounted on the dashboard. The officer inside waved at a group of teenagers waiting at the bus stop. The teenagers waved back. 3 months ago, those teenagers would have tensed up, would have looked away, would have prepared for confrontation. Now they waved. Small changes, but changes nonetheless. Her phone rang. It was her granddaughter Keisha calling from school during lunch break. "Grandma," Keisha said, "I have to give a presentation next week about someone who inspires me. Can I talk about you?" Dorothy smiled. "Baby, you can talk about whoever you want. I want to talk about you. About what you did. About how you didn't stay quiet." "Then talk about that," Dorothy said. "But Keisha, listen to me. I'm not a hero. I just refused to be invisible. And I had resources that most people don't have. The real heroes are Maria and James and Devin and all the others who filed complaints when they had no power, no protection, no reason to believe anyone would listen." "But you made people listen," Keisha insisted. "I made myself loud enough that they couldn't ignore me," Dorothy corrected. "There's a difference." They talked for a few more minutes about school and boys and college plans and everything that 16-year-old girls talk about with their grandmothers. And when they hung up, Dorothy sat quietly for a moment, thinking about the weight of what she carried. She was 72 years old. She'd lived through segregation and integration, through the civil rights movement and the backlash against it, through decades of progress and regression and progress again. She'd built a fortune from nothing. She'd created jobs and opportunities and hope. She'd fought battles that most people never saw, won victories that went unrecognized, survived defeats that would have destroyed lesser people. And through it all, she'd learned one fundamental truth. Power wasn't about money or position or buildings with your name on them. Power was about refusing to be diminished, refusing to accept other people's limitations, refusing to stay quiet when speaking up might cost you everything. Marcus Hendricks had looked at her and seen someone powerless, someone he could dismiss and control and intimidate. He'd been wrong, but his mistake wasn't unique. Every day people made assumptions based on appearance, on age, on race, on class. Every day people underestimated others because they didn't fit the expected mold of power and success. Dorothy had learned to use that underestimation. Let them see the cheap dress and the orthopedic shoes. let them see an elderly woman who moved slowly and spoke softly. And then, when the moment came, show them exactly who they'd been talking to. She'd done it for 72 years. She'd do it until the day she died. Her intercom buzzed. Richard Stevens, the bank manager, asking if she had time to review the quarterly loan approval numbers. She did. She reviewed them, approved 18 new small business loans, rejected 3 that didn't meet the foundation's criteria, and scheduled follow-up meetings with 2 applicants who needed guidance restructuring their business plans. At 11:30, she had lunch with David Morton discussing the ongoing civil suit against the city. The trial was scheduled for June. Morton was confident. "We have everything we need," he said. But Dorothy knew that confidence and victory weren't the same thing. Juries were unpredictable. Justice was never guaranteed. But they'd fight anyway. At 2 p.m., she attended a meeting of the newly formed Civilian Review Board, sitting in as an observer. She watched as they reviewed 3 complaints with thoroughness and fairness, asking hard questions, demanding accountability, but also giving officers the benefit of doubt when evidence supported it. This was what reform looked like. Not perfect, but better. At 5 p.m., she went home to Riverbend Gardens. Her neighbors waved. Mrs. Johnson from 3B asked about her wrist. It had healed, but the story hadn't. Mr. Patel from 2C thanked her for what she'd done. His son had been stopped by police last month, and the officer had been professional and respectful in a way that Mr. Patel said wouldn't have happened before. Small changes, but changes nonetheless. That evening, Keisha came over for dinner. They cooked together. Dorothy's mother's recipe for chicken and dumplings passed down through 3 generations. They talked about Keisha's presentation, about college applications, about the boy Keisha liked who didn't know she existed. "Grandma," Keisha asked as they were cleaning up, "was it worth it? Everything you went through?" Dorothy considered the question carefully. The bruised wrist, the hours of depositions, the death threats that had come through email and social media, the exhaustion, the scrutiny. The way every decision she made was now examined through the lens of the case. The weight of knowing that 22 other people were counting on her to get this right. "Yes," she said finally, "because it wasn't just about me. It was about creating a world where the next time this happens, and it will happen, Keisha. Because change is slow and hard and imperfect, the victim will have a chance, a real chance, not because they own a bank or know lawyers or have connections, but because we built a system that protects everyone equally." "Do you think we did that?" Keisha asked. "I think we took a step," Dorothy said. "One step. There will be more steps needed. There always are." Later, after Keisha left, Dorothy sat in her living room with the lights off, looking out at the parking lot of her apartment complex. She thought about Marcus Hendricks sitting in a cell somewhere, or maybe at his cousin's auto shop, or maybe in his studio apartment living with the consequences of 15 years of unchecked prejudice. She didn't hate him. Hating him would give him too much power over her life. But she didn't forgive him either. Forgiveness required repentance, and she wasn't convinced Hendricks understood what he needed to repent for. Maybe someday he would. Maybe not. That was his journey to make. Hers was different. Hers was about taking the power that prejudice had tried to strip away and using it to protect others. About turning her worst experience into something that might prevent the same experience from happening to someone else. At 72 years old, Dorothy Mae Williams was tired. But she wasn't done. She would keep fighting, keep advocating, keep showing up at city council meetings and review board hearings and community forums. Keep using her voice and her resources and her platform to demand better. Not because she was a hero. Heroes were for comic books and action movies. She was just a woman who'd built something worth protecting and refused to let anyone, not poverty, not racism, not a cop with a badge and a prejudice, take it away. The next morning, Monday, she would walk through that side entrance again. She would review loan applications and attend meetings and make decisions that affected hundreds of people's lives. She would hum her mother's gospel hymn and hand out butterscotch candies and be Dorothy Williams' bank chairman, philanthropist, and grandmother. But she would also be Dorothy Williams, the woman who'd stared down a corrupt system and won. The woman who'd turned 8 minutes of humiliation into months of reform. The woman who'd refused to be invisible. And that, more than any building with her name on it, was the legacy she wanted to leave. Power doesn't always announce itself with fanfare and flashing lights. Sometimes it walks quietly through side doors wearing a $12 dress and carrying a cloth purse with fraying handles. Sometimes it moves slowly because joints ache and years have passed. Sometimes it looks like nothing special, until the moment someone tries to take it away. And then everyone learns exactly what they've been underestimating. Dorothy Mae Williams had taught Marcus Hendricks that lesson. But more importantly, she'd taught it to an entire community, to the police department, to the city council, to every person who'd ever been dismissed because they didn't look like power was supposed to look. She'd taught them that power comes in many forms. That dignity can't be stripped by a badge. That justice, real justice, requires work and sacrifice and courage. And she'd taught them something else. Never, ever underestimate a grandmother who's built an empire from nothing. She's survived worse than you. She's fought harder than you. And when you make the mistake of grabbing her arm in her own bank on camera in front of witnesses, she will use every resource at her disposal to ensure you never make that mistake again. Not for revenge, for justice. For herself, yes, but more importantly for everyone who comes after. That's the kind of power that changes the world. One bank, one complaint, one voice refusing to stay silent. One grandmother at a time. The story of Dorothy Mae Williams and Marcus Hendricks became a case study in police reform courses, a cautionary tale in training academies, a reminder that accountability matters, that prejudice has costs, that the people you underestimate might be the ones who change everything. 3 months, 1 incident, 23 complaints finally addressed. A culture slowly, imperfectly shifting. Dorothy Williams went back to work. But the work had changed, and so had she. And so maybe had Riverside. Small changes, but changes nonetheless. And sometimes that's enough. If this story resonated with you, if you believe that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity regardless of how they look or where they live or how much power they seem to have, then share it. Not for clicks or views, but because stories like this need to be told. Because change happens when people refuse to stay silent. Because your voice matters. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that matter. Stories about justice, courage, and the people who refuse to be invisible. Because power doesn't always look like we expect it to. And the people we underestimate might just be the ones who change the world.